Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. This is going to be a project video. I'm going to talk about putting an OLED display in my Nintendo Switch Lite. Nearly a year ago, I ordered this thing, which is the Retro Remake Super 5 OLED screen. So this is a screen made by YouTuber Odin and a company he started up that basically allows you to swap out the screen on your Switch Lite with an OLED version. It cost me about $100 back in September, and it was supposed to ship, I think, just a couple months after that first pre-order, but it's now been 9 months and it finally showed up on my door. And even though I ordered this thing before the 2024 presidential election in the US, it still had all the tariff effects that came on afterwards. And so I had to pay an additional like $50 in tariffs to get this sent over to my door. So it ended up costing me about $200 overall for this kit. $100 for the kit itself, then $50 in shipping, and then another $50 in tariffs. Now, this is not going to be an installation video. I think that Odin already covered that pretty well on his own channel. But the thing is, I'm not going to do the installation myself. You see, my Nintendo Switch Lite has had some work done to it. I'm not going to talk about that any more than that. But let's just say that I'm not really comfortable putting in this kit on a Switch that has been in some ways modified. So instead, I'm going to send this over to somebody who does this all the time, and they're going to do the work for me. I'm going to pay them a little bit, and they're going to send it back, and we're going to do a before and after video. Now, before I do send it over, I wanted to take a look inside the kit so you can know what's going on with this one. Now, this one is called the Mega Kit, which includes a shell and everything else. It's supposed to be the easiest way to make this transition over to an OLED display. Now, this is not the most expensive model that Retro Remake offers. There's also an HDMI out version via its USB-C port. I also ordered that one. That was my initial order, but that one was delayed even more than this one. And so I ended up writing to the company and saying, hey, can you downgrade me down to just the non-HDMI version? And they gave me like, an additional $10 or $15 refund. And that's how I was able to get my hands on this one here today. For everybody who ordered the HDMI version, I think they are still waiting at this point. There have been a lot of delays with this kit. Either way, let's take a look at this Mega Kit and what you get inside before I mail it off to the guy who's going to do the install. First of all, it looks like we have some sort of heatsink or shield right here, and then we have the kit itself. And it comes with a full shell, which includes additional buttons and everything. So you can see here we've got 2 analog sticks, which are supposed to be Hall sensor. It's also got one of those suction things so you can pull the screen off of the old model. And it also comes with a pretty fancy toolbox as well. This includes a spudger and guitar pick, as well as a small little screwdriver, which is actually pretty high quality, all metal. And then it also comes with a pair of metal tweezers that reminds me of those from iFixit. So I would say this quality components here are actually pretty good. Further along in the box, there is one of 2 hard shell cases, so this is the display itself. And packed in with the display are all of the ribbon cables and connectors that you need to actually hook everything together. Now, this kit doesn't require soldering or anything. It's actually pretty plug and play. There's a couple, fasteners and whatnot, and then ribbon cable attachments. But other than that, that's about it. I think this is something that basically anyone could do, but my worry was that because there have been things done to my Nintendo Switch, I didn't want those to conflict. And so I went with an expert to be able to install it for me. And then finally, at the bottom of the box, we've got one more hard shell case, which is going to have the case and buttons inside. And so within here, you've got the screws that you will use with the case, all of the buttons that you'll actually need, and then the shell itself. And the shell feels pretty good. It has the same kind of quality texture as the original Switch Lite. I was worried it was going to be a downgrade, but I think this is pretty good. Now, if all goes well, I'm actually not going to use this shell. Instead, I'm going to try to preserve my original yellow shell just because I think it looks really cool, but I want them to be changed out with black buttons like the ones that came in my kit. And so hopefully when I get mine back, it'll look kind of more like a bumblebee in the overall color. It's also worth noting the OLED screen has a black bezel. And so I was worried that a black bezel and white buttons was going to look weird. And so I decided to go with all black in terms of accessories, but with this original yellow shell, which I've always loved. One last thing to note with this screwdriver, if you get one of these in your kit, if you pull out the bottom right here, this is where the screw bits are. They're underneath. They're kind of connected magnetically, but these are the screws that you'll actually use to do the mod. So I think in terms of just overall kit, I think this is well worth $100 in terms of the display and all of the things that we're getting with it, the shell and the tools and everything. Like, I feel well taken care of. If I had just a regular Nintendo Switch Lite, then I would be very comfortable in doing this mod myself. The shipping is a lot more expensive than I expected, but number one, I live in Hawaii, so I knew it was going to cost a lot to get it sent over. And then finally, those tariffs were kind of just a bummer right at the very end, where I finally was getting the device delivered and they said, oh, wait, you owe us $50 more, even though they're the ones that had the delays on their end. And so now I'm going to send this kit as well as my Nintendo Switch over to the guy who's going to do the mod and send it back. Once I have that in hand, we'll do a comparison between the old screen and the new. Okay, we're back with a new Nintendo Switch Lite. It's been about 2 weeks since that previous footage, and you can see this thing looks totally different. Like I mentioned before, I sent this over to somebody that I know who was able to do the mod, considering the fact that this does have some additional work to it, and I was a little bit worried about that. So I'm going to give a shout out to them right here, and if you are on Discord, I've got a link to my video description, you'll be able to find them in case you want to commission some work yourself. So the major change here is obviously going to be the new OLED display, but then also all of the buttons you can see are now black. And that's because they swapped them out with all of those that came with that mega kit that I had bought previously. So instead of having an all black console, I have my original yellow console, but with these new black buttons. And the buttons themselves are really high quality. It almost feels like a new fresh coat of paint on my Nintendo Switch Lite because these buttons feel nice and snappy. I bought my original Switch Lite during the pandemic, so it's about 5 years old, and I think I actually bought it used from GameStop as well. So it has a lot of wear and tear on it. So this is kind of like new life into the device right now. It just feels really snappy and nice. These analog sticks are also improved. They are Hall sensors, but to be honest, they just kind of feel like the old ones as well. I've never been a big fan of the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con style sticks, and so these still kind of have that floppy feeling to them, not like something more modern like the Odin 2 or the Retroid devices. So not a huge fan of these analog sticks, but I've never been a fan of them. But overall, I think it really does look nice. I love the fact that they went as far as even putting in the black game card slot and the micro SD card slot. It just makes everything pop a little bit more. The major change that I'm getting used to is this black bezel. You know, my original model had a clear bezel, and so this just seems like a bigger stark contrast. But it also does make me very happy that I went with black buttons here because I think it just kind of all fits together. Again, more like a bumblebee motif. So overall, I'm happy with the overall mod in the sense that, yeah, it looks a little bit different than I was expecting, but still looks really sharp and snappy. Now let's talk about the screen itself, and before I sent this over for modding, I actually filmed a bunch of footage, different screens and whatnot, so I could use that for before and after footage. It is also worth noting that during the installation process, you have the ability to choose between either what they call natural or vibrant saturation on the screen. And the person who did the mod recommended I go with the vibrant option, so that's what I went with, just to make sure that the colors really pop. Now, first point of order, when comparing these screens side by side, the biggest thing that I noticed is that the color balance and overall temperature are definitely changed with this new OLED display. I always felt like my original screen had a greenish tint to it. It used to drive me crazy, and now you can see that it feels a lot more balanced. The best example for me is the Breath of the Wild screen that you can see right here. It seems to be just a more natural color and what I would expect from playing this game. Same thing with the Crash Team Racing logo. I love how deep and blue it is altogether. And the updated color balance permeates through everything that I've been looking through here. Let's take a look at the Mario Kart 8 title screen. And the big giveaway for me is the left side of the screen where you have the menu bar. This just seems to be a much more balanced color overall as opposed to up above where it does look a little bit green. You can also see on the right side when you're looking at Mario on his cart, it is a lot redder as well. And so I really like the overall distinction here. You can also see that the darks are a lot darker on the OLED panel and gives it a nice sharp contrast. Here's another example with Super Mario Wonder. You can see that the reds and blues on Mario just really pop a lot more. In fact, every color seems to be a lot more prominent. Princess Peach, Princess Daisy, Luigi, and even Elephant Mario. All of these are really showing through a lot more. And again here, especially with this white background, you can see that the color balance just seems to be a little bit more skewed towards red than green on the OLED panel, and I like it. Here's another example with Super Mario 3D World. The big thing for me is all the water in the background. You can see kind of behind the title screen. It looks really cool, like it's a lot deeper of a blue, and so I really like the overall color here. Same thing with Catsuit Mario. I like the fact that there's a little twinge of orange in their yellow costume, which you cannot see in my original Nintendo Switch Lite display. Another nice distinction here are the colors in the word Mario in the title itself. They just pop a lot more with the OLED panel. So yeah, overall, I really like this look. In the end, the improvement between the two is a little bit more subtle than I was expecting, but still very distinct, especially when looking at my footage back to back. Like with New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, there's definitely a distinction here, but it's a little bit more subtle than I was expecting. Yes, the darks are darker and the colors are more vibrant, but it's not a huge night and day difference between the two. In other words, I think it is a definite improvement, but I'm not sure I would call it transformative. If anything, I would say that the enhanced color balance is actually a more striking improvement than the actual saturation and contrast ratio. If we look at something like Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, this one definitely looks better on the bottom, but I think it more has to do with the color balance than the actual color saturation. In fact, if we do a side-by-side comparison with my Nintendo Switch OLED with the vibrant setting turned on, you can see that the colors are more saturated than with the Nintendo Switch Lite OLED. Now, it is a subtle difference, and it seems to be skewing more towards the reds. For example, Mario's hat seems to be more saturated up above, but then the blues are darker and more saturated down below. But I think just in terms of overall balance and being pleasing to the eye, I think that the Nintendo Switch OLED up above just looks a little bit better than the OLED on the Lite. So long story short, the OLED Lite screen is definitely better than the stock screen on my Nintendo Switch Lite. The colors do pop more, but I found that the balance of the colors themselves seems to be a bigger improvement than the saturation itself. Now, one unique thing about this OLED mod screen is that it's not a 720p resolution like all the other ones that come stock. This is actually a 1080p panel. So that means that this 720p image that we can see here is actually being scaled up to fit in the 1080p resolution. And there are some concerns that this does cause softening with text in particular. And so one other thing I want to test in this video is actually zooming in a bunch to see whether or not I can see any changes in detail and sharpness when looking at the stock screen as well as this new OLED panel. So each of these are going to be in a 400% zoom from my 4K footage, so essentially a 1080p image for each of these here on the screen. And up above we have the stock display, and down below we have the new OLED panel that was now installed. So first thing, let's look at the text itself, Super Mario 3D World and all that stuff underneath. And, zooming in as much as I could not see any difference in detail and sharpness between the two. I have seen complaints from others saying that they can see it with the naked eye, but even here, zooming in with a 4x zoom, I'm not seeing it personally. In fact, zooming in like this actually highlights how nice the OLED panel makes everything pop. If we look at the Koopa on the far left, you can see a lot more definition around his cheeks, and then also the shell that he's chasing is also darker and more pronounced. And same thing goes with that cat Goomba, as well as some of the details on the lower half of Mario, and so on. And so I think that it actually looks better on the OLED display when zoomed in 4x. Here's another example with Paper Mario Thousand Year Door. Again, this one has a bunch of text at the bottom, and these look equally sharp to me when zooming in 400%. So again, I'm not having any issues when it comes to sharpness and detail when looking at this screen. Also bear in mind this is a 400% zoom, which means that this is not the same as looking at it with a naked eye. And then finally, one more test with Mario Kart 8, looking at the text on the left side. And to my eye, it looks like the text on the bottom is sharper than the one up top. So for me, I'm not seeing any of that softening that other people are seeing. Now, in all fairness, the Retro Remake pages don't say anything about the fact that this is a 1080p display that is being scaled up from the 720p image. And even though, at least to my eye, I'm not seeing any sort of defects in this scaling process, I think it's something that probably should be disclosed. After all, these screens are made for enthusiasts, and enthusiasts are exactly the type of people who want to know whether or not the display perfectly matches their Nintendo Switch Lite. So long story short, when it comes to the quality of the screen itself, I think that it is definitely an improvement over the original. The color balance is the thing that really sets me off between my stock and OLED displays. I think that is a big improvement. Secondly, I do like that contrast ratio. I love the fact that the darks are darker than they were previously. And then finally, I also do like that the colors pop a little bit more. They don't pop quite as much as I would prefer, but I have always been someone who prefers a very saturated screen. So in other words, I would say that it's pretty obvious that the color balance is better, same thing with the contrast ratio, but the saturation leaves a little bit more to be desired for someone like me who prefers an overly saturated display. Now, for those curious, I also did a little bit of testing with my Odin 2. I don't want to show off any actual Nintendo games here because I am emulating on the Odin 2, but at least here with Ninja Turtle Splintered Fate, you can see that the saturation is actually a little bit better on the Odin 2 versus my Switch Lite OLED. It's especially apparent when you look at the word turtles, which has a deeper green compared to the one on the bottom. Another good example is actually in-game. You can see that the red arrows underneath Raphael are a lot brighter red compared to on the Nintendo Switch OLED. And my only reason for really showing this part off is to demonstrate that, if you don't want to go through the pain of modding an original Nintendo Switch Lite, you can also use an emulation handheld to play your Switch games as well. And all those hiccups that come with Nintendo Switch emulation will still apply here, the fact that not every game is going to be compatible and so on, but I did want to mention that, the Odin 2 Portal still looks very good, even compared to my Switch Lite OLED. Now, in my haste to get this thing over to the person who did the mod for me, there are a couple things that I probably should have tested in hindsight. And the first one is overall screen brightness, because this is a brighter display. It goes up to 600 nits. And then also battery life. Like, how does the battery life look with the stock display versus the OLED one? So I don't have those two tests to show off, but I did some testing afterwards just to see how everything looks. And so first thing we're going to do here is test the brightness of the Switch OLED versus the Switch Lite OLED. And going into max brightness here, you can see that yes, the Nintendo Switch Lite OLED is actually brighter than the original Switch OLED when going to max. Now, personally, I do think it's a little bit too bright to use indoors, but that's a great sign if you are wanting to play this outdoors. And so, I like the fact that it does get very bright. Now, on the other hand, going down to minimum brightness, these also get very dim. So the Nintendo Switch Lite OLED seems to get just as dim as the original Nintendo Switch OLED as well. And so this means that the Nintendo Switch Lite OLED will be excellent to use in the dark as well. Say, for example, you're playing, next to your significant other. This isn't going to bother them because it doesn't get very bright at the minimum brightness. And so even though I don't have my old Nintendo Switch Lite to compare with, I am happy with the overall brightness and dimness of my Nintendo Switch Lite OLED. For the most part, I've been playing mine around 60 to 70% brightness, and that has been perfect for me in a wide variety of use cases, like in the evening and during the daytime, and mostly indoors. And then finally, like I mentioned, I wanted to test out battery life, but I didn't test it out on my old Nintendo Switch Lite before swapping out the screen. So what I did here is a mixed usage scenario. So I started off with like Breath of the Wild, and then moved on to other games like Crash Nitro Kart and Ninja Turtles and Mario Kart 8 to give you an idea of what a typical use case would be. And I found that I got 2 hours and 51 minutes of battery life with my Nintendo Switch Lite. Now, because this is the only figure I have to work with, I don't really have any comparison here. I don't know if it's better than it was with my LCD display. And there are other factors to bear in mind, like this is an older Nintendo Switch Lite. It's like 5 or 6 years old at this point, which means that, the battery life on this thing is not going to be as good as it was when it first came out of the box. So if anything, it's just another piece of information to kind of keep in your back pocket is that, Russ from Retro Remake OLED gets a little bit under 3 hours of battery life with his Nintendo Switch Lite with an OLED panel. So putting this all together, you might be wondering whether or not I recommend an OLED mod for your Nintendo Switch Lite. And this is one thing that's kind of hard to recommend just because it's actually sold out everywhere as of making this video. So I think the better question at this point is whether or not I think it was worth it to do in the first place after this, 9 to 10 month process that I've gone through. And the only thing I can really speak to is my own experience. And I can say that for me personally, I didn't really find it to be worth it. Number one, you have to take into account that the Nintendo Switch Lite costs $200. After that, you need to factor in what kind of screen you're going to get. The very cheapest screen was priced at $55, but to get touch enabled on your device, which I think is kind of necessary for many Switch games, it's going to cost you another $15. So that's going to be $70. And if you want to get the mega kit like I did, which will give you new buttons and a new case, that's going to be another $10. So that's going to be $80 altogether. And if you want to add HDMI functionality to that, it'll be $90 for an upgrade kit or $115 for the mega kit, which will come with its own case. And bear in mind that this is all going to be before taxes and any applicable tariffs. Like I mentioned previously, it cost me about $100 for my overall kit. I started with the HDMI one, but then asked them to change it to the touch one, and it cost me $95 at the end of the day. From there, I had about $50 in shipping to me in Hawaii, and then also an additional $50 in tariffs because I'm located in the United States. So altogether, it cost me a little bit under $200 for this kit in the first place, about the same price as my Nintendo Switch Lite. On top of that, I expected a 2 to 3 month wait, but it ended up being about 9 months, and because it was delayed so much, that's when I was hit with those tariffs. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is a big visual improvement, and I'm happier with my Nintendo Switch Lite right now than I was before. But I do have a hard time justifying the fact that this was nearly double the price of my Nintendo Switch Lite in order to improve the visuals. So I think it really comes down to you and what you prioritize when it comes to your Nintendo Switch experience. If you already have a Switch Lite and you think that, paying upwards of $150 or $200 to get this improved experience is going to be worth it, then sure, I can see this being like a mid-cycle refresh of your old Switch Lite. And it is nice that if you get that mega kit, you can get a new case and new buttons and even TMR joysticks. So all those are nice improvements over the overall experience. And also bear in mind that there is some risk when buying from this company. We've already seen, major delays, and they keep pumping out new projects without fulfilling some of their old ones. Like I mentioned before, the Switch Lite OLEDs are no longer even for sale at all, and they're now starting to promote their Super 7 IPS and OLED options. And these essentially are supposed to improve the screens on a regular Nintendo Switch as opposed to the Switch Lite, and that's not even mentioning their other Mr. projects. They have the Mr. Pi, which goes in and out of sale, and they've also promoted what they're calling the Super Station, which is a PlayStation-focused Mr. I also pre-ordered this one several months back because I love the idea of a PlayStation-focused FPGA machine, but it's been very quiet about this thing as well. And so I would caution that based on what we've seen over the past year or so, if you plan on buying something from Retro Remake, maybe settle in for a longer wait than you may expect. So I hope that this video has given you enough information to decide whether or not a Switch OLED upgrade would be a good fit for you. For me personally, I love my Nintendo Switch Lite. It's my favorite Switch model out of all the others that I've tested before. And I love the way that it looks now, but I'm not sure whether or not the weight and the additional costs were worth it for me in actually doing this mod. So my recommendation would be that if this ever goes up on sale again, to balance out all the costs and whatnot, especially when it comes to shipping and tariffs, but then also watch that installation video from Taki Udon to see whether or not that amount of work is going to be a good fit for you and your skill set. When it comes down to it, if I had a time machine and I was able to go back to the old Russ, the guy who actually pushed that checkout button, I would probably, in hindsight, not actually go through with it, so that way I didn't have to have those months of waiting and that additional tariff charge at the end. I think I would probably have just been happy with my Nintendo Switch Lite and saved myself a couple $100. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.